this is just a quick video to accompany my latest blog post, which looks at the basic crochet stitches when they are worked in rounds and rows. So here are the swatches that I'm going to be showing you. We've got single crochet, half double crochet and double crochet. That's in US terms. In UK terms, that will be double crochet, half treble and treble. Couple of things to note before we start, some quick definitions. So working in rows is simply where you work to the end, turn and work back. That's the most straightforward. Then when working in rounds, there are actually 3 variations. So you can work in unturned rounds, turned rounds and continuous rounds. So this swatch is worked in unturned rounds. So I crochet round and then join, and then I make a chain and I start working in the same direction for another round, and so on and so forth. Turned rounds will be where I work round, get to the join, turn and work in the other direction. So turned rounds are going to have a similar look to rows. And lastly, we have continuous or spiral rounds where you keep working in rounds, you don't join, you just work into the top of the first stitch from the previous row. They're commonly used in amigurumi and that kind of things. So let's have a closer look at the swatches now. So we're starting here with the single crochet swatches. Got 15 stitches and 15 rows. Here I've got 30 stitches because it's worked in unturned rounds and 15 rows. You can see the texture of the 2 fabrics is quite different. This is what we call the right side or the public side. That simply means it's the side facing you when you work. If I turn this inside out, you can see again, we've got quite a different texture from the other side. So in rows, when you're working the same stitch row on row, your front and back are always going to be the same. When you're working in unturned rounds, then your front and back or right and wrong sides are going to be different. Essentially, this is the front of the stitch and the other is the back, where here you're getting front, back, front, back, front, back, so on. When we look at the gauge or the size, you can see that this swatch is a little bit longer, which means the gauge is a little more relaxed when I'm working in unturned rounds than when I'm working in rows. The variation happens because you can see the top of the stitches have a slant, so working that way versus that way is just going to change the row height. I've put all the detail gauges in the article, so I won't go into that there. Width-wise, it's hard to compare exactly because obviously we've got that in rounds. They're roughly the same. The last thing I want to show you in this comparison is when you're working in unturned rounds, you tend to get this wandering on the seam. So I wanted to take a moment to look at that in the different stitches. So you can see here I've got my end and my start tail, and you can see that that is on a slight slant. Crochet stitches tend to slant, so typically when worked in these unturned rounds you can see the slant across. Not necessarily a bad thing, just something to be aware of. If you work in turned rounds, which will give you a texture like the rows, then you will find that your seam remains straight because the slants even out. That is single crochet. Next we'll move on to half double. So here we have the half double crochet swatches. You can see this is how the stitch looks worked in rows, and this is how it looks in unturned round. There's really quite a big difference again here. I think this has a lovely sort of texture, but feels much more uniform, whereas this you get like a kind of ridged pattern. From the inside, again, it looks really quite different. This actually surprised me when I made the swatch because I don't make this switch. I don't make this stitch in unturned rounds very often. So again, that's really quite a different stitch pattern, but I like it. Gauge wise, again, the stitch worked in unturned rounds was marginally longer, same as with the single crochet, and more relaxed gauge, so stitches are taller. As a reminder, I have the same number of rows or rounds in both swatches. I think we're probably again pretty similar with the width. So the stitch gauge is similar, the row gauge is different. When we look at the slant, I think this is the most pronounced movement in the half double in unturned rounds. So you can see here, that's where I fastened on, and then you can see that slant where the seam wanders across. So again, something to be aware of if you're using this stitch. So that is the half double crochet comparison. And lastly, we have the double crochet. So here is our rows of half double crochet, which you'll all probably be super familiar with. And here's the double crochet worked in unturned rounds. Again, you get much more of a zigzag type pattern in the double here, and you can kind of see these spaced out ribs. Whereas with the double crochet worked in unturned rounds, you get a much more uniform kind of pattern. If we look at the inside or the wrong side of the double crochet stitch worked in the unturned rounds, so another really interesting one that you don't see very often, you get this kind of lovely ridge there, which I think if you want to introduce some texture, that could be really interesting. And when we look at the slant, this actually surprised me. And I would add the caveat that everybody's tension and the way they hold the crochet stitch differs, so you might experience different. But I didn't find much of a slant on the double crochet. You can see it starts there, and yes, there is a bit of a slant, but it's about 3 stitches worth of movement over 15 rows. So if you're making a sleeve or something, you might find you just get away with that slant. So there we have our comparison of the 3 basic crochet stitches worked in rows versus unturned rounds. I'll pop a link to the blog post, which has a lot of photos and talks about this in a lot more detail, but I just wanted to give a video overview for those of you who prefer to watch. Hope you found that useful. Any questions, do just drop them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Please do subscribe for more tutorials and crochet goodness.